All right. So excited to cover this topic with you guys. My roots are in environmental. I started out with Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, so our state regulators here in Texas. So that's really where I started to dabble. And then from there, over the years, have gotten engaged with obviously the health and safety side. And as we'll talk about, very much a natural progression for me, going from environmental to health and safety, because as we'll talk about, there's so much overlap, there's so much connection. So I think that everybody here probably knows more environmental compliance than they think. So that's the point of our conversation, is to start to bridge those gaps, and it gives us a wider perspective of potential risks and maybe hazards that are playing into those risks that we didn't even realize were there. So like I said, my name is Abby Holovach. If I've not met you, I'm from Fort Worth. I'm also our Region 3 Vice President. So going into year 2 of 3. So love our group, love ASSP. It's brought a lot to my professional development. So I'm excited to be able to share these back with you guys. So hopefully it'll be helpful. We will share the PDF as well. All right, so starting our conversation here, we tend to put EHS into separate boxes, as we know. A lot of folks are very, laser focused, health and safety. That is their duty, that's their title, that's what they do. So things like injuries, of course, PPE, lockout, tagout, all these safety world things that we deal with. And then we shove environmental completely to the other side a lot of times, where we have this very clear, hardy division between waste, stormwater, our spill plans, air, tier 2, and permits. And I think it's a territory that a lot of, traditional H&S folks are uncomfortable with that transition. But as we'll talk about, our operations, whatever, facility you work at, whatever it may be, it doesn't work in boxes. For example, a leaking tote can simultaneously become a safety and environmental issue. Chemical exposure, a slip hazard, a spill, it affects our stormwater plan potentially. Now we've got maybe hazardous waste that we're dealing with, an emergency response. And so it's these kinds of things where we directly see environmental health and safety coming together. So if we're not paying attention to one, like all of the environmental components, then we're going to, again, miss potential risks that, we definitely want to make sure we've gotten ahead of. So that's kind of what this is all about, is how do we remove this artificial divide? And always put in the asterisk, you don't have to be an expert. There's no need to be an expert. Maybe you're not interested in becoming an environmental expert, and that's completely perfectly fine. We all have our niches and things that we're good at. But the goal here is to not have that mental barrier, because if we have that mental barrier, we are going to miss things. So this is what it's all about, breaking that barrier down. So regulations may separate the programs, maybe your background, maybe your training, but we know real world, day-to-day actual events don't. They don't have that barrier. They don't care what your title is. So we got to be ready regardless. All right, so this is typically, hopefully the audio will work, typically very short, but what you hear when you ask sometimes some health and safety professionals about environmental.
I missed the part where that's my problem.
I missed the part where that's my problem. To quote the old Peter Parker from your OG Spider-Man movies, which is how long ago now? They've made like 50 million more. But classic quote, I missed the part where that's my problem. But in real world, wrong. Definitely wrong. If we're not paying attention to those environmental cues, those environmental risks, at some point we are going to see a direct intersection with your health and safety program. And that's really what we're going to focus on, is, again, getting rid of this mental barrier. That's not my problem, because it is. That's wrong. We see direct overlap, and that's what we're going to focus on. So, oh, there it goes. Okay, perfect. So if you have your phone, maybe you're not on your phone, those of you who are able to do this, we'll just take a minute or two. I'd love to hear from you guys. When you hear environmental compliance, what are some of the first things that pop into your mind? Whether they're good or bad, not going to hurt my feelings. So if you're able to do this, take a minute and we'll see what pops up. And hopefully some people are actually on the computer, not all on their phone. We have 3 people typing. EPA, regulations, more EPA, yep. Hazardous waste, rules, sea turtles, I like that one. Stormwater and erosion, so many permits. Ugh, I like that one. Fines and compliance, permits, yep, fuel registrations, paperwork, confusing, intimidating. What are you hiding? Non-occupational, hazardous waste again, and permits. So, yeah, regulations, all great points. Spills, yep, absolutely. Uh-oh, I like that one too. Permits, yuck. And these are all valid points, including don't lick it. That's a good one. That's both health and safety and environmental. But that's a perfect one right there. Collaboration in response and info above my head. And that's kind of what we're trying to shatter today. Is a lot of this is really within your wheelhouse, whether you realize it or not. It's just a bit of poo, Title V icky, all great. So I appreciate all of that feedback because it's totally true. We have a mixed bag here when we think about environmental. But whether you realize it or not, you're probably already doing environmental work. So if you've inspected chemical storage, if you've managed safety data sheets, maybe you've responded to a spill, maybe you've got, above ground storage tanks on site and you're checking things like containments, the integrity of the tank, managing waste containers. Maybe you've investigated a chemical release, contractor activities, emergency equipment, training. All of these things in some form or fashion are a part of environmental as well. And so that's why we say you may not realize it, but this is already happening. So congratulations, you're already halfway there if you've done even one of these things. Because I think we've seen also a lot of incidents in the past couple of years where, whether it's a chemical incident or, some type of meltdown at a facility, people get hurt, people have been killed. And we've seen 2 incidents already this year. Thankfully no one got hurt or killed in this one, but the one that was in, near where we had our ASSP conference in Garden Grove in California with that tank situation. There was also the tank situation, which did unfortunately have, fatalities up in, I believe it was in Washington with the white liquor. It was at a pulp factory. It makes paper. But we saw a direct, overlap there between environmental, health, and safety. And that's, again, where this comes into real world is a lot of it is getting ahead of those risks. Because if your environmental is not on lock, that in turn can lead to issues with health and safety, like chemical exposures that we've seen. So, same skill set, different endpoints. And the thought process is remarkably similar. So, few examples here, and this will be stuff you can go back, of course, reference whenever we share the PDF and we'll read the whole thing. But things like the questions you're already asking. So, can this hurt someone? Like a worker, a contractor, a visitor, in the safety mindset. But the environmental version, very similar. Can this impact the environment? But the shared discipline there, hazard identification. It's really just the receptor, the receiving receptor, that's changing. How does it get there? How could exposure occur from the safety perspective? Inhalation, skin, ingestion, injection. Same question, environmental. How could a release occur? Is it going to get in a storm drain? Is it coming out of our, air emissions stack? What about a spill to soil? So we're all looking at the pathway analysis. What's the source? What's the pathway? And what's the receptor? So again, very similar routes here. We're really walking hand in hand. What controls are needed? Safety perspective, we got things like our hierarchy of controls, and then environmental version, very similar, but definitely overlaps health and safety, secondary containment, good housekeeping, treatment. Maybe you got a wastewater treatment facility. Well, there's gonna be a lot of health and safety aspects there if they're trying to balance out the pH. So same hierarchy of controls. What if the controls fail? How do we respond? How do we prevent reoccurrence? So we're all asking the same questions. It's just we have maybe different endpoints. But what we'll find is all through that, this is what's happening. Overlap, overlap, overlap. We may separately step out for a little bit, but we're going to overlap again. So our thought processes, again, are remarkably similar. So we're doing a little environmental tour. We're going to touch on kind of our main environmental media and connecting health and safety to things like stormwater, our spill plan, hazardous waste, and air. And I feel like those two right there, well, really those 3, I think spills, waste management, and air emissions, those are some of the biggest 3 that we see overlap, just because, we're worried about those potential receptors. And anytime we're handling waste, anytime we're utilizing some type of, air emissions control units, a lot of that same stuff is going to come back to health and safety and the workers that are, actually engaging and interacting with that material on a regular basis. Same for tier 2. So, our chemical reporting goes back to emergency response. If we've got a release at our facility and we've got certain volumes of chemicals, we're supposed to notify the local authorities about it. It may fall under environmental, but when you start to think about it, it really is health and safety for everybody involved. So, kind of just a roadmap of the different things that we are going to explore together. All right, so give it a minute, should pop up. But this is our next question. Where do we personally see environmental overlap with health and safety? In your experience, I don't know why it just left us. In your experience, where have you seen the overlap? Maybe you've gotten pulled into things that, you didn't anticipate. Oh my gosh, what is happening? Getting pulled into. If this would cooperate here. Okay, I won't touch it again. All right. So where you've gotten maybe roped into environmental and you were like, oh, that was more involved than I thought it was going to be in terms of I didn't realize environmental played such a heavy component into this. Maybe a problem you were trying to solve and you backtracked. Policy writing. Yep. Ammonia release. Absolutely. Training. Yep. More training? Absolutely. We definitely see a lot of overlap there. Yeah, Title V permit when they brought in new equipment. Recycling. Yeah, definitely chemicals and air pollutants. BMPs, our best management practices around the facility and housekeeping. We see direct overlap there as well. Yeah, more training. Chemical cleanup. Absolutely. Dealing with things like HAZWOPER. Wastewater tank with no permit, chemical exposure, sulfuric acid in a warehouse with forklifts, remediation, lead abatement work, chemical storage, paint booths. Can I throw this away? Yes, always a good question. Policies and liability, exposures. Yep, we got to think where those exposures come from. Maybe it was something that wasn't done right on environmental side. Incident response, spill plans. All amazing examples. Yep, and I think we can all, as we start to kind of reverse and backtrack where these things connect, and this is where we start to see environmental rear its ugly head. Here it comes. Because again, if we don't have environmental on lock, then we're going to start to see a lot of this cascade into health and safety issues, like an emergency response plan. Great point. Yep, so all good input there. Again, please don't lick that. Yes, always a good rule of thumb. All right, so starting out with our first environmental media, so stormwater. So environmental concern here, of course, any industrial activities that we have going on, and usually in some form or fashion, we're going to have pollutants. Then we've got to look at it, could it potentially get into the storm drain system, into our waterways, maybe have a regulated discharge. So in this case, things you're already looking at are a part of this thought process, like leaking equipment. Your concern may look a little bit different than the environmental perspective, but we both are concerned across EHS. How are we storing chemical containers, waste accumulation areas, loading and unloading, damaged containers? All of those are going to impact, of course, not only stormwater, but also the employees who are working around those materials. So there's stormwater issues as well as health and safety. So this is where, again, we see the direct connection here. So whenever you're walking your facility during maybe a general walk around, whatever you may do periodically, we want to look to think when it comes to stormwater, if it rains right now, where does everything go? And this is important because we want to look for areas like storm drains, ditches, low spots, maybe exposed materials that look like they could have previously been leaking, because this is where we're going to see those same exposures that you're worried about, from the health and safety perspective. Not to mention, we start to think, okay, if worst case did happen and this container released, where's it going to end up? Because is that where I'm going to have to send my people to go help clean it up or go help as part of the response? And what does that look like for that person? Where are they going to have to go? I was recently at a site where we were doing a general stormwater, just facility walk, identifying their outfalls. And God bless the safety manager. We were walking by these big tanks that were laying on their sides that were just in storage. And we're walking past to try to get to this area near the outfall. And he goes, watch out for these right here. And as we're walking through, we hear this ding. And he had dinged his head on there and was bleeding. And we were like, oh my God. It was exactly what he warned us about. And it happened to him. Poor guy. But it's a great example of, a stormwater, periodic inspection or sampling event may be environmental, But have we thought about the health and safety perspectives? Where are they going to have to go collect those samples? Is it somewhere they could get bit by a snake? Is it somewhere where there could be, water that's running that's not going to be a safe situation? So again, this is why we do not want to compartmentalize these two different programs, because if the environmental side didn't think that through, now you're potentially having some type of, recordable injury. So environmental inspections are often exposure pathway inspections as well. Where are my people going to be exposed on a regular day? And where are they going to be exposed if things go wrong? And we do have a release. So for example, maybe we've got a fuel leak from mobile equipment in an outdoor offloading area. So each lens may see something a little bit different. We put on our safety hat. We're seeing slip hazards. We're seeing, okay, obviously there's issues with the equipment. What type of employee exposure are we concerned with, depending on how much fuel is potentially leaking on a regular basis. And environmental, of course, is concerned with the stormwater impact, spill response issues, that best management practice failure. Versus operations, of course, they're doing their own thing a lot of the time. They're concerned about equipment at downtime. How much is it going to cost? But core base of this, same condition, just different consequences. So we're still concerned with the same problems. It maybe just looks a little bit different in terms of perspective. So this very clearly shows us a lot of the overlap that we're going to see continuously. So another table, we won't read the whole thing, but again, just perspective to be able to look back on. So leaking equipment, of course, environmental, we're concerned with a stormwater pollutant. But maybe the worker hazard there might be, maybe it's something under pressure, a hydraulic injection. Maybe it was something that was heated. Now we're worried about burns. So we may share the same controls. Drip pans, a preventative maintenance program. It's hitting all those bases in one full swoop. So environmental and health and safety concerns. Things like loading and unloading. Environmental, we may be concerned about transfer spills, releases during a spill or during a transfer. And then from the worker perspective, the health and safety, things like chemical exposures, forklift traffic. So our shared control here could be attended transfers, traffic control. So again, here they are melding together. Vehicle wash areas, maybe we're concerned with non-stormwater discharges, but health and safety is concerned with chemical exposures, again, high pressure. That's why we have designated areas, PPE, etc. So again, we're trying to hit both sides of the house. So again, these are the same things you're thinking of. So this is why we say you probably know more environmental than you think. It's just a matter of connecting those dots. Same for our BMP maintenance. Permit requirement may be required by a permit, but worker hazard maybe is part of those BMPs. They have to go into areas maybe to put out absorbent boom, cover a drain, clean up certain areas. Well, that may expose them to a confined space or an area where there may be heat sources or other potential exposures. So again, shared controls, we want to make sure across the board we're meeting the BMP, but we're also protecting the people doing it. So no surprise here where we see the overlaps. And this is pulling just straight from a stormwater plan. I'm sure many of you on the call have your own plan, but for those facilities who don't, just showing you where we could potentially have the overlaps. And there's a lot of them here. For example, this facility deals with like concrete powder. They make concrete product. So for your first BMP over on the under good housekeeping, control and removal of cement, dust, and fines. So regular sweeping and vacuuming of cement, dust, or of cement powder, dust collector fines, tracked out material, immediate cleanup of any spilled cementous material to prevent high pH runoff, use brooms, vacuums, or mechanical sweepers. So, okay, great, environmental, but the wheels start turning at the exact same time. Now I'm starting to think, all right, well, what are my health and safety concerns here? Potential, inhalation hazards. Like, obviously we're dealing with a lot of cementous dust. So what does that look like for the people who are having to do these BMPs? So that one's a pretty obvious connection there. Even things like housekeeping for wood pallets and packaging debris, storing pallets in orderly stacks. I mean, very basic, but not having leaning pallets upright. So again, we can see even within this real world stormwater plan where for each of these BMPs, I'm already pulling out the direct connections to health and safety. So not going to read through the whole thing, but again, just shows you real world direct connection here. All right, so moving more into kind of our spills and SPCC territory. So let's say we've got an employee transferring a liquid chemical from a tote into a smaller container in an outdoor offloading area. The hose disconnects and we have product flowing across the pavement, and we have a storm drain approximately 20 feet away. So in this case, we have to ask, what do we do first? And what problems are developing at the same time? So right off the bat, this is where we see the crossover, because we're dealing with a chemical. So now not only are we concerned with it going down the storm drain, but we're also concerned with employee exposure. We're concerned with it potentially spreading. And then we get into, all right, where are our spill kits? Are our people actually trained to use those spill kits? Is there actually PPE in that spill kit that's commensurate to the hazard? Do they know how to wear the gear? Do they know how to report now? So again, this is where we see all of this conglomerate coming together. So it's all happening at once here. Safety's asking questions like, what's the chemical? Was anyone exposed? What PPE is needed? Is the area safe to enter? And we've got slips, fire, vapor hazards, reactivity hazards, depending on what the material is. And then again, environmental concerns. Can it reach a drain? Can we protect the drain? Is it reportable? What are we going to do with the waste now? And how did this happen in the first place? So again, we're all asking the same questions. What was the root cause? Did we follow our stormwater plan, or if it was oil, our spill plan? Were our BMPs in place or not? And then again, operations may have their own questions, like why did the hose disconnect? Was the transfer attended? Was containment available? And were the employees trained? So we're all asking the same types of questions. We're all seeing the overlap across the board. So the first few minutes of the spill, we see simultaneous thought processes here: worker safety, environmental decisions, and an operational decision. So in this case, if the only thing you're thinking about is the health and safety perspective, then look how many other things we could potentially be missing, which could lead to an inadvertent exposure. So move into SPCC. So this is more than a question of, do we have enough oil to need a spill plan? So from the safety professional perspective, we're walking, maybe we're concerned with things, like the bulk tanks, who maintains them? Is there any pressure associated with the systems? What does it look like when we need to do preventative maintenance? Where's the shutoffs? Versus, things like drums and tote storage. Who's having to do all the material handling, the ergonomic situation there? Versus environmental, of course, is more concerned with where's the nearest navigable waterway. And then safety is going to ask, well, what happens if the containment does fail? Again, who's going to have to actually respond? And how does that look? So very similar to what we just discussed on the stormwater side. So secondary containment is definitely a good example of where we see direct overlap, because containment can prevent the environmental release, but a poorly designed or poorly maintained containment, of course, is now going to create a whole cascading effect of additional hazards: slips, trips, and falls. Maybe difficult emergency access. Like, I always like to ask the question, if the worst happened now, could I do this, this, and this? And then you walk through that process. Chemical exposure during cleanup. Maybe there's fire hazards, maybe because there was a lot of fuel that's accumulated in that containment. Now we've got flammable vapors, not to mention your manual handling hazards. So a control risk for environmental, having secondary containment, can sometimes create another if it's not done right to begin with. So that's why we need both lenses here to make those right determinations and prevent those potential exposures. And so this is where we go right back to the examples I gave at the beginning with a few of the incidents we've seen this year, both of which, were related to, tank management, tank design, tank inspections, which we hear the word tank, tank, tank. Many people are going to think, oh, environmental, but clearly not. Spill kits, another one. We have spill kits, we hear that, oh, great, but now we want to ask things like, is it appropriate for the material? If you're dealing with a lot of caustics or a lot of corrosives, acids, bases, what kind of spill response equipment do you actually have? Do you have your people trained on it? Do they know when to use it? Are they even accessible? Do your employees know when to use them and when maybe to not use them? When to draw the line of, this is beyond my capability, we need to call for some external help? And not to mention, are we actually preparing them and setting them up for success? Like in that photo right there was a facility I was at. We've got very large, not very large, but there were multiple of the larger storage tanks for things like oil and fuels. Well, that tiny baby spill kit isn't going to do a whole lot other than dabbing up, a little drip or dribble. So again, we're not really setting our people up for success, which means they may come in more contact with that spilled material than they should because they're trying to make do with the scraps that they've been given. Who decides incidental versus emergency? So this goes right into the crossover between maybe when a spill plan is being put together of where do we draw the line of what's safe for our people and what level are they trained to actually respond? Because the spill plan operating in, one realm may not consider the fact that health and safety perspectives, your people have only been trained to maybe a defensive HAZWOPER, standard versus like a technician offensive level where they actually go and perform the cleanup. Well, if that communication isn't there, expectations over here may not meet real world expectations over here. So again, that's where we see the overlap. So a spill kit is not our spill response program. It is not an environmental only issue. This is probably one of the biggest areas we see a lot of direct overlap between health and safety and environmental. And it's all the same things you're already thinking of from the health and safety perspective. So another table for us, where do we see the safety overlap with spill response with our SPCC plans? So we go back to, all right, what spilled? Environmental may be concerned with the resulting waste. What's its, EPA waste code? Is it going to be a reportable spill? And from a health and safety perspective, we're worried about, all right, what gear do they need to do the cleanup? What toxicity levels are we dealing with here? Do we even have the right monitors, for example, to detect it? So it goes back to our shared controls of things like SDS inventory. Maybe how much? So environmental may ask questions like, what's the reportable quantity threshold? When do we need to actually call the state or the National Response Center? Health and safety is asking questions like, what's its vapor concentration? Immediately dangerous to life and health. What levels is that at? And we got to know the quantity first. So we can see it directly cascading one into another. All the more reason why we don't want to compartmentalize these conversations, these thought processes, and why we don't want the Peter Parker quote of, I fail to see how that's my problem. Ignition risk. Of course, environmental is concerned that it's a flammable material out of where it's supposed to be. You're concerned with the fire and flash risk. So that's where, LEL meters, hot work setups, or stop really if there's been a spill. Decon. Again, environmental may be concerned with the rinsate that comes from decon. And you're concerned with residual on our skin, on our gear. So both of us have to put our heads together when it comes to how do we set up the decon line? How are we handling the generated waste? And one of the most important ones is probably who's going to respond. So like I mentioned earlier, where do you draw the line between an emergency spill event and an incidental spill event? What level of HAZWOPER training do they need? And do you have that written criteria? Because that's going to be in the spill plan. It should be in probably one of your health and safety plans as well. So again, directly connecting the dots. And it does help to merge the two worlds and put your health and safety knowledge right next to the environmental knowledge. So what I have on the screen is just an example. It was a spill response guide I had made for a facility, basically where we did this in Excel, but then made it into a PDF. So our first page was all about the spill response guide. What is a non-critical or incidental spill versus a large spill? And what do they need to do before they ever respond to a spill? And it covers both environmental concerns and health and safety concerns. And then we made one-pagers, which of course I know it's like text for ants. You're not going to be able to read that. But in real life you could. So it went through the different types of chemical families they had on site. We've got things like their pictograms, class 1 through 9 DOT, hazard class, what are the primary hazards, sign of exposure, cleanup materials that are acceptable to use, prohibited actions, what PPE do they need, cleanup guidance, disposal guidance, non-critical versus a large spill. So again, we can see direct overlap here. And if we had compartmentalized one thought process and not considered the other, are we really protecting our employees, or are we missing a huge gap? Now, hazardous waste. Now I have to restrain myself because I love hazardous waste and waste in general. I was a waste investigator. That's where I started with TCEQ. So anything waste related, I always will jibber jabber on for a while. So I'll keep it short. But this is where we see a lot of overlap, especially what I've seen at a lot of facilities where the health and safety person doesn't feel comfortable with things like EPA waste codes, waste classifications. But when we start to talk about it here, you'll see where you're like, oh, I already knew that. I already realized that. I see how this is directly related to what I already know. So things like What is it? How's it classified? How are we accumulating it? Where are we storing it? And where's it ultimately going to go? And then from health and safety perspective, we're concerned with, can we handle it without getting hurt? The employees who are actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. But those decisions can't be separated. So again, we're going to see congruency here. So waste containers, technically a lot of these are safety equipment too. So when we're looking at waste areas from both environmental and health and safety perspective, we don't want to stop it as the container closed and labeled. We're also considering all these health and safety aspects that, again, you're already looking at, but it does directly impact environmental. So what is the container condition? Is it compatible for the material inside? What about the spill potential like we just talked about? Where's their closest emergency equipment? You know, things like the eye wash station, the spill kits, and employee access. So compliance from the environmental perspective may not always equal safe. So you looking at things from the health and safety perspective directly comes into the turf of environmental. How are we going to store these containers? Who's going to be handling them? Are they trained, know what to do if there's been an incident? And all of that goes right back to the environmental principles. So it could come into a domino effect here. Someone pours the wrong material into a waste drum. We have a chemical reaction. Now we've got heat, pressure, and vapor generation, and we've got somebody who's been exposed maybe to fumes, a fire. Now we have emergency response, a spill release. Now there's a new waste stream generated from cleanup. We've got environmental reporting and an operational shutdown. So not outside of your realm of health and safety. This is directly within your wheelhouse. So one bad decision, one bad waste decision become a full EHS event. But like we said, having the perspective from health and safety, what does this look like in terms of environmental with the waste types that we're dealing with? Are people inhaling those vapors? Are they potentially handling it without the right PPE on? And again, you may know more here than you think. So when we talk about waste characterization, it's not as crazy as it sounds. Really, are we dealing with hazardous waste? And if so, what kind of hazards are we concerned with? So we start to speak the same language here. So we don't want to have those mental barriers up because you'll start to see, oh, okay, that makes total sense. So things like what PPE should they be wearing handling it? Do they need ventilation? What fire hazards exist based upon this material? What happens if that container leaks? All of the exposures. So your waste knowledge is going to be directly commensurate to the hazard knowledge. And again, we can go back and root cause it. If we've had an incident, an exposure, we can go back and look and say, all right, what type of waste were they dealing with? Oh, it was potentially a flammable material. They didn't ground and bond. So again, this is where we see the direct connection. So looking at different types of, just in a nutshell, characteristic hazardous waste. These are some of our most common versus listed. Things like ignitability. Environmental. It's anything pretty much has a flash point less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the environmental perspective, how we're classifying it. Also could be some oxidizers and flammable gases. From the worker safety perspective, this is where all of your knowledge comes in. Fire, flash fire, how are we grounding and bonding? These shared controls, ignition source control, cabinet quantity limits, areas where we are storing waste, what operations are in the vicinity. So again, a lot of the same things environmental is looking at, you're also looking at. Like corrosivity. Hazardous waste is anything less than 2 over 12.5. So of course, worker perspective, skin and eye burns, maybe respiratory irritation, container failure and release. Again, we're all looking at the same hazards though. What kind of gear should they have on? Where's the nearest eye wash? How are we going to segregate? And toxicity is typically one we see more so for those long-term chronic exposures. So again, all things that you're already thinking about, you just haven't realized that it is an environmental way of thinking. In terms of like maybe it's a hazardous waste for lead. From your perspective, you're concerned with those long-term exposures, secondary sources of contamination. So we all come back to the same shared controls of exposure assessments, respiratory protection, hygiene practices. But again, it all started with environmental, and it's all the same principles that you already know. Sometimes it's just in a different language. Real world, maybe you're looking at a manifest. Great way we can already start to deduce hazards from this. And this is why, again, don't be fearful to dip your toe a little further and into environmental, because you'll start to see why it's so important. So this is a hazardous waste manifest. So we've got a shipping description, number and type of containers, and box 13 is just for EPA waste codes. And these waste codes, I always equivalent them to like HAZCOM, where we've got quick, immediate hazard communication. So for example, D001 immediately tells us this is ignitable hazardous waste. Important for anyone handling it. Again, the grounding and the bonding. Where are we storing these containers? How are we storing them? What containers are we using? But all the same things you're concerned with as a health and safety professional to prevent exposures. D008, lead compounds. Tells us right off the bat this is hazardous for lead. Well, that would clearly be a concern if you have people that deal with that on a regular basis, chronic exposures. What gear are they wearing? How are they handling it? And how are they potentially being exposed? So again, we may start with environmental, but it's still speaking your language. It's just a matter of actually spotting it and interpreting it. And then same for our immediate communication, when we see on a drum, on a container, very clear hazardous waste, and it tells us it's a flammable liquid, D001. Again, that is already in your turf, in your territory, because now we're concerned with all of the hazards and risks that goes with handling an ignitable or flammable material. So it's not new information, it's just a little bit different way of looking at it. Now, air, another area where we see a lot of overlap, where again, some of the things you're already doing, you may not realize, is environmental. So when we think air permit, we picture a stack, but air emissions usually start right where our people are working. So painting, welding, solvent use, even emergency generators, maybe as they're filling tanks, chemical mixing, whatever it may be. But again, we may think, okay, under a Title V environmental permit, but a lot of the same controls we put into place for environmental, we see the same need on the health and safety perspective. So same chemical, two different questions. Maybe now you've opened up a paint booth and you're spraying paint, or you're sandblasting, or you're maybe have a new process system where you've got tanks, vats full of chemical. Well, environmental may ask, well, how much are we emitting? Pounds per year, tons per year. What's our permit limits? Control efficiency. So it goes back to things like air emissions and our engineering controls that are in place there, and record keeping. And the industrial hygiene, health and safety perspective is, well, what is the employee breathing in? Parts per million, what's our time weighted average? What's our ceiling? All of that kind of stuff. But same source, similar concerns. We just have different measurement and regulatory questions. But again, this is where we see a lot of if you track back to how was someone exposed in the first place, maybe it's because the controls that should have been put in place for that environmental permit were not where they should have been. So that's why we want to have a good understanding of how does this start from the environmental perspective, and how is it going to trickle down to me on the health and safety side. So like ventilation, for example, where we commonly see this come into play, a very common type of engineering control, operations installs an exhaust ventilation. Safety says, okay, great, we reduced worker exposure. But from the environmental perspective, we also have to ask, well, where did you send it? Where is it actually coming out, which could still be a safety question. Because if that ventilation is discharging right outdoors near maybe an outdoor operational area, well, we've got to look at, all right, again, who is that potentially going to affect? How effective is that ventilation in terms of filtering out the contaminants? So we still have the same problems here. So a workplace exposure, in a lot of cases, ends up being an air emission. So we see direct overlap here. So controls need to be evaluated together, the entire system, and in unison, because you may ask questions that all of a sudden bring up environmental concerns, or vice versa, which I see that all the time. Especially in situations, for example, maybe you got dip tanks. This is commonly where we see it. Again, we've got ventilation, we've got fume hoods. But for this type of operation, again, if all we're thinking is health and safety, then we may miss those environmental exposures that could trickle down. So looking from this perspective, we could easily pull an air permit and start to look to see, all right, this was what originally said in the air permit, the types of contaminants we're concerned with. Here's how much it was estimated that this would actually be discharging and releasing. And then we connect it right back to health and safety. Well, what does that mean for the people physically working in this area? What does that look like for them? So again, same types of questions, same line of thinking, sometimes just different endpoints. So safety overlap summary on our air side. Of course, VOCs are volatiles, the environmental trigger. We're concerned with permit limits, tons per year. Worker exposure side, vapor exposure, flammability. So shared control here could be closed containers, like our ventilation, our capture units. Maybe we're concerned with things like carbon monoxide. Could be a combustion limit from the health and safety perspective, but could also be for you an asphyxiant concern, depending on where that carbon monoxide is being discharged. So things like our alarms. Acid mist, there may be a scrubber requirement on the environmental side. Worker side, we're concerned with inhalation hazards, corrosive burns. So now we've got scrubbers, hoods, PPE. So again, same shared controls here, same territory, maybe just a little bit different perspective. And then moving into our last example kind of chunk here. So one chemical inventory, many regulations. So one tote sitting at your facility, depending on what's inside, could impact your HAZCOM program, could impact PPE requirements, fire code issues, tier 2, spill plan. Then it goes right into environmental, waste management, emergency planning. So it's triggering a lot. So chemical inventory management is where we see a lot of these issues come directly together, the biggest bridge between EHS. And so that's why we want to understand it from the environmental perspective. And again, you're probably already looking at it like that and you just don't realize it. So of course our SDSs, everybody's using these for a variety of purposes on the EHS spectrum. So it's more than just a HAZCOM requirement that we've got to have them. Of course, we're looking at things like, all right, what hazards exist, dermal, respiratory, etc. What PPE is recommended, first aid, exposure controls. And environmental is using that exact same SDS for things like the CAS numbers. What about physical state, flashpoint? What are we going to do if there's a spill? How will we characterize the waste? And what reporting requirements are there? So same document, different questions. And if you start to look, all right, you're looking at it from the hazard perspective. Well, what is all the things on the list environmental is looking at? Those are all from the hazard perspective as well. Maybe with a different intent, but it's looking at it for the exact same reason. So this leads us right into tier 2. So tier 2 reporting, a lot of times, which I always thought it was a little bit odd that it was lumped in with environmental, because I feel like this one, if anything, is more health and safety than any of the things that we've talked about. It's not just another report. This one right here is directly tied to our emergency planning. If something goes wrong, of course, we want our first responders to know what do we have at our site, how much is at our site, and if anything changes, we're supposed to update them. So to me, that's always like, I don't know if that's really environmental. That sounds a lot of health and safety. So again, things you're already probably tracking. So what hazardous materials, how much SDSs, have we made emergency arrangement with the local authorities? And even if you aren't required to do tier 2 reporting, it's always still a good idea to bring those, first responders out to your site. We don't want the first time they've been out there is during an actual event, and that's an environmental and health and safety concern. So when we ask the question, who needs accurate chemical information during an emergency? Well, we all do. So tier 2, again, one of our most critical areas where your environmental manager may be doing the tier 2 reporting, but you need to sometimes be like, all right, it might be good if we looked at this together, because they may be reporting on something that you didn't even realize was going on, or vice versa. So maybe potential exposures there that need to be captured. So you as a safety pro may have half the data, because this is where we're pulling information from for a tier 2 report. Chemical inventories. Let's look at those SDSs. And it actually has to, if you've ever done a tier 2 report, you actually have to list out what are the hazards. So what physical hazards, what chemical and health hazards are there? So in that case, the environmental professional is filling it out is directly having to pull from the health and safety side. What type of container is in place? What's the max quantity that could ever be on site? So who already knows this in most cases? Well, this is kind of a village event. Safety, operations, maintenance, purchasing, environmental. Tier 2 is where we really see a lot of different parties coming together. And again, it's all these things you're probably already doing. You're already tracking. Again, we don't want to be afraid to dip our toe in here. So tier 2 is a great example of why siloed data does not work. We need all these pieces to the puzzle to accurately plan for an emergency. So safety overlap here, chemical identity, what's its reporting applicability? HAZCOM PPE is our worker concern, but shared control here, one inventory, one SDS file. So we see direct overlap. Things like container type. Environmental may be concerned with, all right, I just have to put it on this report. But for you may be concerned with, well, what's its failure mode? How does it need to be, preventative maintenance on it? So shared control is those container inspections. Facility contact. We have to list a 24-hour contact when it comes to tier 2 reporting. Of course, worker hazard, we're concerned with the same thing. If this was to, bust in the night, who are they going to call it to in the morning? It's probably going to be the same phone number. So again, we see a lot of overlap when it comes to tier 2, and a lot of these things you've already considered, you're already doing. So kind of coming towards the end here, because I know I'm coming up on 12:50. So we want to add that additional lens to an environmental, or add environmental, that lens to your JHA. So we're already asking what could hurt the employee, but why not add one more in the process, or in this, process of questions? What could leave this process? What could leave this operation? And if we think like that, it could either be air, it could be waste, it could be a spill. All of those could potentially be something leaving the process, which could be a potential exposure. So we think about air, water, waste containers, offsite transportation. What could leave the process is one question that often catches a surprising number of environmental issues. And if we can already kind of start to integrate that in and stop, compartmentalizing it, we may start to open up the floodgates to identifying more hazards, identifying more risks, and then we can get ahead of it. So it runs both ways. Final example for you, blast media from an outdoor booth, which in most cases, we shouldn't be blasting outdoors, but there are some booths that are not fully contained. It's gone out as non-haz for 11 years. They run testing on it, a T-clip test, and it comes back at 8 milligrams per liter. So it's hazardous waste for lead. In this case, real world example, what the determination revealed, the media is lead bearing. Environmental profiles it out for disposal as lead, hazardous waste. Safety response, you look at it from airborne exposures. Booth is cleaned by dry sweeping and blowdown. The environmental response, well, we need a container there at the point of generation in order to collect that waste. Safety response, no dry sweeping, no compressed air. We need wet methods or some type of HEPA vac because we don't want to expose people to all that, fine dust. Maybe someone's been shoveling it and bagging it by hand. Environmental, of course, maybe concerned with labeling, closed containers, inspections, and you're looking at things like gloves, respirators, coveralls. But they both are sharing very similar controls. Maybe things like nobody was trained on the real hazard. Well, environmental, maybe looking at things like, all right, does this affect our generator status? Do they need additional training if we're shipping this off as hazmat? And for you from safety, we're looking at it from the HAZCOM perspective, maybe some lead-specific training. But like we said, if we're not considering any of these environmental components and we just jump straight in to try to identify the hazards, well, good luck with that because you're missing all of these huge chunks to it, these other operational steps that are going to cascade down and affect your employees. So we really want that holistic perspective. You don't have to be an expert, but we want to make sure we are trying to put on our environmental hat and tune into that and not be afraid to do that because you're probably doing a lot of it already. So you don't need to become an environmental specialist. Just expand what you already look for. Asking questions like, if this container fails, where's it going to go? If we see a drain, do we know where it discharges? Maybe where am I going to have to send my people to respond? When we see waste, do we know what it is? Because that's going to lead to a bunch of other questions about, chemical handling, material handling. When we see exhaust, well, where's it going? That's an environmental and health and safety question. And when we see a new process, we do want to think about who reviewed the environmental impact, because probably those very same concerns are your concerns. So 5 questions that connect environmental and health and safety. What material activities are here? What can go wrong? Who can be exposed? Where could it go? And what happens after it does? So those are 5 questions that can uncover a huge percentage of environmental health and safety risks. So not just one compartmentalized thought process, these can really be all encompassing. So however these questions may look for you, we want that full picture. Again, nothing wrong with being a health and safety expert. That is your niche, that's your jam, but don't discount environmental. And again, you're probably doing a lot of it already. It's just a matter of cognitively breaking that wall down and making the connection. So stop managing them as separate problems. Stormwater isn't just water, waste isn't just disposal, air isn't just emissions. They're all pieces of the same risk management system. So everything is connected. So last question that I have for you guys here, as it'll pop up. What's one thing maybe that you think of that you might go back and look at your facility, where maybe you can pull that E in to your H&S, or maybe something you're already doing that you didn't realize really was so connected to environmental? People are pondering. I see one person typing. 2, 4, 5. I'm excited to see what they are. Done all of this in my career before. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. Where you start to see, all right, I know way more than I thought that I did. I've already been doing all of this. Checking the spill kits to make sure they're sufficient for what we have. Absolutely. Basic training for both sides to understand that connection. Yep, those are great points. Create your spill response plan. Even if you're not required to have an SPCC plan, have one in place anyways. Yeah, go back to the team, explain the differences and how they're interconnected. Make environmental considerations part of every H&S discussion. And I think that that's really important. Don't have 2 separate meetings, one for environmental and health and safety. Well, you can, but periodically come together. It's a great point. Yep. Yeah, never made the connection, but it all makes sense. Absolutely. Yep. Checking if they actually understand their spill plan, 100%. That's always critical. So all great points, and I don't want to cut anybody off, but final takeaway. Safety asks, how could this hurt someone? Environmental asks, where could this go? And what could it affect? So savvy EHS professionals, we're going to ask both. Who could it hurt? Where could it go? Who's it going to affect? And in turn, hopefully we will meet all 3 of our goals: protecting the worker, protecting the environment, and protecting our operation. So why can't we have both? We can. That's the beauty to it. So thank you guys so much. That's all that I have for you. I know there were a lot of things popping up in the chat. Check out what's going on.